I'm very honored to be here today, and I was asked to talk about the Middle Eastern perspective on these wars. And so, in some ways, it's going to be negative. I mean, to just put it out there before we get going and talk about this. To put it, I mean, we can even make that an hour and a half, about a minute conversation. People in the Middle East do not like these wars, so there you have it. But I really want to do a little bit more than that. I actually want to talk about a couple of things. I want to take us through about a century. And what I would like to do this morning, first of all, is I'd like to talk for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then leave at least half an hour for questions and answers, because that's far more interesting to me and to you, and you don't have to hear me drone on for too long. But what I want to do is I want to look at about 100 years, the American century, if you will, in the Middle East, and I would like to look at that span, that long narrative arc, because I want to see how things have changed, because things haven't always been this way. And I would like to take, to give you sort of the global image, I would like to take this building as a metaphor. Now, most of you probably don't know what this building is. It's called Dodge Hall, and it's at the American University in Beirut, which is considered to be the Harvard of the Middle East. It was established by Presbyterian American missionaries in the 1860s, so it's been around for about 150 years. In fact, they're celebrating their 150th year, centenary, or whatever you call it, this year. And this building stands as a metaphor, because when it was built, somewhere around the Dodge Hall was built in the 1870s, it was seen as a beacon of American learning, and American knowledge, American ideals, of liberal arts education, democracy, and inquiry. But what is really interesting is that Dodge Hall gets blown up. A bomb explodes, and it's damaged heavily. Thankfully now it's been rehabilitated and everything. So, and this happens almost 100 years after it was built. It's almost the 100th anniversary, somebody blows it up. So in some ways it stands a metaphor for America's presence in the Middle East, where this very building starts out as an indication of how people thought of this. And by the way, they thought of it very positively, as you'll see in a few minutes, because people flocked to the American University in Beirut to get learning. They saw it as something that will help create what was called in the Middle East Nahda, or the Age of Enlightenment. And then about 100 years later, it's blown up, because it's seen as a symbol of American imperialism. And part of the problem that we see in this is that for people in the Middle East, history is absolutely ever present. In the United States, it's not so much. It is, of course, ever present, as you very well know, in our lives. We are still dealing with the ghosts of the Civil War and slavery in this country. And we can think of many things that are still with us. But in fact, American ideals tend to be future-oriented. And history is rather poo-pooed. It's not something ever present. People in the Middle East have a different take on history. They have been living with history for over 6,000 years. And history is a lens that they use to understand everything. So this issue with the Dodge Hall is not simply a matter of somebody just blowing up a building, but it's actually a reflection upon the transformation of America and how it's seen in the Middle East from a beacon of hope to imperial power. And in that sense, that's one of the key factors that is different about how people see America from outside and how people, at least from the Middle East point of view, and how people see it from within. Within the United States, we like to think of the United States as a democracy, as a republic, as a place that is actually providing something for hope for the world. From the point of view of the Middle East, that may have been the case in the 1890s and early 1900s. However, by the time we get into the 21st century, the United States is seen as the evil empire. I hate to put it in such stark terms, but I'd like to take us through a journey to understand why that happens. Because this didn't just happen because of Islam. It didn't just happen because people in the Middle East are born out of their mother's womb with a bomb in one hand and the Quran in the other going, "Death to America." It happened because of history. And that's what our students do not get. 9/11 happened because of history. The global war on terror and the invasions of the United States invasions in the Middle East later on happened because of history. In other words, for us to really understand, that's why you're here obviously, to understand what's going on, we have to understand the historical narrative arc that I'm talking about. So, let's start. if you want to divide the presence of the United States in the Middle East, one could take 1948 as a very convenient point. World War II, if you will. If there's before and there's after. Obviously, it's a very facile argument because it's a much more transitional, a lot more gray, but we'll take it as our as sort of pivot point, if you will. So before 1948, the United States has been involved in the Middle East for a very long time. As I said earlier in my comments, American missionaries started going to the Middle East in the 1860s, primarily Presbyterian missionaries, and primarily people from the Northeast. Although there are some folks that came from North Carolina, but very few. But the majority were coming from the Northeast. This is the American Presbyterian Missionary Board that sent people to the Middle East to convert, the heathens, so to speak. And by the way, the heathens were the Christians. So, upon their arrival, and it's wonderful to read some of these letters actually, because they're really quite fantastic to me. I've read many of these journals and letters, and these incredibly well-meaning sort of people who are going there to convert, and they get so despondent. Their first despondency is learning Arabic. They despair so quickly, the poor schmucks. I mean, it just frustrates the heck out of them. And then nobody's converting. I mean, they don't quite get it, right? Muslims, of course, are not allowed to convert, so that's a serious problem because the majority of the population is Muslim, but you have to keep in mind that at the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, there's a very sizable minority of Christians and, of course, Jews. And in fact, the greatest hostility they ever faced were from Christians. Because you can imagine, Christians in the Middle East who have been living Christians for about 2,000 years, and of course they always claim Christ to be sort of relevant, right, next door, seeing these Americans arriving and telling them that they're not being really good Christians. It didn't sit well with most of the local Christian community. So the short story of this is that they failed. They failed at proselytism, they failed at missionary work, and they really didn't have much to go with. So ultimately, they changed tactics, and they started building hospitals and schools. And there, they succeed brilliantly. Because in many ways, these missionaries weren't just Christian missionaries, they were American missionaries. And they knew it, they understood it. They saw themselves not only as bringing Christ into the lives of people, as Jesus the Savior for those folks there, but rather they thought about bringing American ideals of education. Many of them were graduates of places like Harvard and Yale and other Presbyterian colleges throughout the United States. So they themselves were imbued with this notion that there's a sort of a marriage, if you will, between Protestant, evangelical Christianity and American ideals of democracy. They sort of had merged in their own things, and in some ways, this Syrian Protestant college, as it was called, before it was called the American University of Beirut, was the emblem of that. And they built a series of these, by the way. The three major ones are the American University of Beirut, the American University in Cairo, which comes much later, and then ultimately Boğaziçi University, which is in Turkey. And these things become very powerful centers for learning. People start flocking to them. And by the way, what is really interesting, it's not only Christians that send their kids, very quickly Muslims are sending their kids, because they recognize these educational institutions are central for modernity and for gaining, jobs and what have you. But not only that, there was this incredible excitement about the intellectual element of this. I'll give you an example. There was Darwin, there was a professor at another American university in Japan who was very well known as authority on Darwin, and he was coming to give a lecture at the UB, Syrian Protestant College. The staff, the American staff, canceled the visit because they considered it to be controversial and they didn't want Darwin and evolution. The students protested, and they went on strike. They stopped going to classes because they wanted to hear about Darwin. This is in the 1880s, 1890s, right? My point here is that there's this incredible excitement about the process of learning and what America stood for. So American missionaries are the beginning. But the second part, and this happens especially during World War I, is of course Wilsonian principles, what America stood for. And by the way, America stood for this kind of liberty and all that, not because people didn't understand that America had its own imperial past. In other words, these people weren't idiots. They knew about Native Americans. They knew about the Philippines. They knew about Cuba. They knew about, Mexico, which is basically the southwest of the United States today. So they knew that America had a history of imperialism. But nonetheless, at the core of it, it appeared to them that America stood for these democratic ideals. And of course, when Wilson issues his 14 points during World War I, that was seen as a beacon of hope. Especially in the Middle East, that was being divided up by the colonial powers, France and Britain. The Ottoman Empire, which had, in essence, controlled the Middle East for 500 years, it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multi-linguistic empire that spanned all the way from what we know today, Turkey, all the way to North Africa. 500 years of history, World War I interrupts that. And the French and the British are busy dividing up the Middle East into what we know today. Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Egypt. You know the map. But that map was being divided up by these colonial powers. It wasn't the will or the desire of the populations in these countries. None of them were ever consulted in this process. In fact, the whole decision was made by two generals, Sykes and Picot. Very much in secrecy, in 1916, they had decided what's going to happen after World War I to the Middle East as we know it today. And the decision was made to divide it up into areas of interest where the French and the British can expand their colonial empire. Now, for people living in this region, not only were they not consulted, but colonialism had a severe impact on their lives. And I want to explore that just a little bit because it really means a lot to understand what happens in the 21st century with the United States in some way, in essence, echoes what the British tried to do in the 1920s. So that's the history that a lot of people live with. And by the way, it's a very much history that I grew up with, learning in schools. So it's a very lived kind of history. So in World War I, at the conclusion of it, this Middle East that we know today was divided up. And one of the countries that was made up, and this is an example I want to go with, is Iraq. Iraq did not exist. There was no Iraq. But then, of course, there was no Lebanon or Syria or Jordan or any country. There were no nation states. Two problems happened with this. First is that the idea of nationalism, at least as implemented in the Middle East, was not the idea of nationalism as implemented in the United States, whereby it is not an issue of ethnicity, but rather an issue of belonging to the Constitution, to this idea of the United States. Rather, it's a notion that nation states are made of single ethnic groups of people. So, Turkey is made of Turks, right? Bulgaria of Bulgars, Greece of Greeks. Of course, that's an absolutely ridiculous notion. There's no single place on earth that you can create that kind of ethnic purity without ethnic cleansing. So in essence, the very premise of nationalism in the Middle East, this idea that people belong together, was a false premise on the basis of demographics. But it was also false on the basis that just because you are Shia, Muslim, you belong together. That somehow your religious sect determines that you should belong with every Shia person in the world. Or just because you're a Kurd, you should belong with every other Kurd. Because you know from your own Thanksgiving dinner that even within the family, you don't always want to hang out with your family that long. So there's a false premise underlying the foundation of these nation states. And it was a premise that was imposed upon the people. Nobody consulted with them. So when Wilson sends King and Crane, one is a Chicago businessman and the other was the president of Oberlin College, to the Middle East, to ask people there, which was a new thing, by the way. Nobody had ever talked to them before. The Americans are sending these two envoys to ask them, what do you want for your future? And what is really interesting is that major percentage, somewhere around 95% of those who responded, and we're talking about hundreds of interviews that they carried out, possibly thousands, responded saying, if a colonial power has to be in this area, we want it to be the United States. Right? So first of all, they rejected colonialism. They rejected the idea of that you have to have a European power or Western power being the overlord of these countries. But if it has to be, then let it be the United States. Because they believe that the United States has no imperial past within this region, has no imperial designs for the region. They did not trust the French and the British because they saw them as arrogant imperial powers. The French had a name for their empire. It's called the civilizing mission. It was a purely racist notion that they were very blatant about. That is, it is what Rudyard Kipling talked about, the white man's burden to uplift the small brown, green, purple, orange people of the world. And the French were very much enamored by that, as they are enamored by themselves. So, for people living in the region, World War I meant the death of a 500-year history. It's not that they completely warned it. I'm sure many people wanted to go beyond it. But the problem is, they were now saddled with two things. One, is a new nation state. They had no idea what it meant. Iraq. What the heck does Iraq mean? I mean, you come out, you know you're from Mosul, you know you're from Basra, or if you ship to Syria, you know you're from Aleppo. Your identity is really much more local. And now you're being told you're Syrian, you're Iraqi, you're Lebanese. So as you can very well imagine, that led not only to confusion, but to tensions. And that should not be surprising, because how do you define a nation with this kind of mixture? Now, please do not misunderstand me. I don't think there's any way you can draw any map without tensions. Look at the United States. Right? We have a civil war every 4 years. We just call it the presidential elections. So in essence, tensions are not somehow unique to the Middle East or unique. Every nation state in the world is made up. There is no natural nations. Yeah, some can claim going back 1,000 years. Some can claim going back 2,000. I mean, growing up in Lebanon, every year we just kept hearing about the Phoenicians. And you know, the Phoenicians created the alphabet. Right? And that basically means that all the Lebanese are descendants of Phoenicians. Well, we don't speak Phoenician, I don't have a Phoenician name, and I have no Phoenician religion. But my brother and sister were not Arab or Phoenicians. And we have arguments over tabbouleh and kibbe all the time about this. But the point I'm trying to make, the problem for the Middle East isn't that there were tensions. Every society has tensions. The problem is twofold. One, the very mechanisms that are meant to create a liberal civil society where you negotiate your tensions peacefully. Again, elections, an independent judiciary, an independent press. Those things were suppressed by the very colonial powers, the French and the British, that claimed they are there to create democracies. Right? They are the very ones who enact censorship. They are the very same ones who make sure that the judiciary is not independent, because it is inimical to their own interest of staying there as long as possible. So they create a nation, push a group of people together with a lot of tensions, and then they deprive them of the tools that you need to resolve these tensions peacefully. And in fact, the very opposite happens. They model governance through power. The very French and British who claim they're there to bring civilization and democracy model the fact that the only way you can govern is that if you have an army and you use it. So they undermine the very democratic tools that you need to create a democracy, and then they model authoritarianism even as they speak about democracy. You get my point here? Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, for those who respond to King and Ukraine knew all of this ahead of time because they have had experience with the French and the British since the early part of the 19th century. And they knew all of this. This is nothing new to them. They have seen it again and again. And they knew that if the French and the British take over colonial power within the Middle East, it's going to be a long time before they can get it on. And that's why they appealed to the United States, because they didn't see that the United States had any intrinsic interest in being colonial power, at least in the region. So, again, when you have 95% of the people responding that they think the United States would be a much better colonial power, that tells you that people really thought positively, at least about, in the theoretical sense, about the United States. So the question is, what happens? What changes? How do we go from Dodge Hall, standing as a beacon of American learning, to Dodge Hall, seen as a symbol, at least by some people, as a sign of American imperialism? What changes in that process? What changes is World War II and the position of the United States in the world. There is no doubt that we have been an imperial power since the 1880s. And people would argue we've been imperial power long before that, the way we sort of moved forward with, I guess, Native Americans. But our entry into the imperial club that Rudyard Kipling wrote White Man's Burden poetry about when we took over the Philippines, that was his poem to celebrate America's entry into the imperial club, really isn't complete till World War II. That is when, as you all very well know, we become the true superpower. The French and the British have lost badly, and we emerge as the most powerful nation in the world, with the Soviet Union trying to catch up. So what changes is the United States shifts its policy in the Middle East from Dodge Hall to being, in essence, an imperial power. And the key to that are these two elements. Now, I do not care whether you think it's good, it's bad, that's not the issue I'm trying to say here. It's not about your politics or what you think or do not think. This is about what people in the region think. Right? So you and I may agree, disagree about the United States policy around, but that's not the issue here. The issue is how people see this policy from the region, because you have to understand why people get so resentful of the United States. And from the point of view of the United States, from the point of view of the people in the Middle East, whether we're talking about Iranians, Turks, Arabs, the United States, after World War II, seemed to care about the Middle East only for two reasons: oil and Israel. In other words, strategic interests completely overwhelm any American ideals. And that begins the downturn in how people see the Middle East overall. How people in the Middle East see the United States. Now, as you all know, the State of Israel was created in 1948, in May 1948, and the United States was the first country that actually supported the creation of the State of Israel. And not only that, we worked very hard with the United Nations to have a recognition of the creation of the State of Israel. In other words, the United States threw its mighty power behind the creation of a Jewish homeland in what was considered by people in the region to be an Arab land. Again, this is not an issue whether it's right or wrong, completely irrelevant. But from the point of view of the majority of people living in the region, it was seen as a pure injustice. Pure injustice. I can guarantee you that you will hardly find a single individual in the Middle East today, who is not, of course, Israeli, Jewish Israeli, that would say that it was the right thing to happen. And they still remember the Balfour Declaration, and they still remember the United States intervening to help create the State of Israel. But the second part, and I think it's even more powerful increasingly now, is oil. Right? Not olive oil. Although we have a lot of good olive oil. But the stuff we use in our cars. With the shift from coal to oil for the world's navies, oil becomes a strategic asset. And with the discovery of oil by the British, first in Iran, southern Iran, and then later in eastern Saudi Arabia, a massive amount of oil, in some ways the fate of the Middle East was sealed there. As one Chapel Hill comedian once said, I want to know how our oil got under their sand. That is how we think about Middle Eastern oil. That's how we came to think about Middle Eastern oil for a while. And by the way, the reason Middle Eastern oil is so good is because it's easy to refine. It's very cheap to refine. It's very light crude, so it doesn't have a lot of crap in it, and so it's much less expensive to refine. But anyway, the United States, beginning with FDR and thereafter, begins a series of relations within the region that are premised on these things. So what we basically decide is that we only care about the region as long as the oil is not interrupted. Because from the point of view of the United States, with a navy that's spanning the globe, we need that oil. This is long before the flats of North Dakota was with fracking and all that. We were still highly dependent on that oil. But what's interesting is, it's not only that we were highly dependent on that oil, the world economy was dependent on that oil. We only ever got about 16% of our oil from the Middle East. So strategically speaking, it's not that big of a deal. But Japan and Europe heavily depend on this, and the global economy heavily depends on this. And therefore, control over this was very vital. And if you look at the map of the Middle East, you will recognize very quickly that the Soviet Union is a lot closer to the Middle East than we are. So, beginning with World War II, we became very concerned about it. And so, in essence, we put aside ideals, and we support regimes like the Saudi government. Now, the Saudi government is medieval. There's no other way to say it. It's not to say they're all bad people. It's not to say they don't try to make it better for the people. If you travel to Saudi Arabia, anybody been to Saudi Arabia? I'm sure the Saudi government will take you on a tour. I'm not kidding. We took our students on a tour. It was fun. They treated us very nicely. Because of course it's propaganda, which is fine because we eat good food. But the Saudi government is an anachronism. It shouldn't exist. It's a royal family that controls one of the greatest wealth on earth, and that has deprived its population of any real rights. And I'm not just talking about women here, I'm talking about men and women, the Shia minority as well as the Sunni majority, and that in essence does things that should not really exist in the 21st century. It shouldn't. But we have always supported them. In fact, Saudi Arabia would not exist without the United States, because they had a lot of oil fields. So the point I'm trying to make here is, beginning after 1948, this is how we start shifting. And we leave our ideals behind for this purpose. So, starting with Israel, which really, to this day, remains a cancer in the Middle East. Not the state itself, but the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It still is a drag on the people of the region, both sides. It's a conflict that has dragged people down for too many years, and it will continue to do that till it's resolved. But in essence, these are the two pictures of how people see them. On one hand, of course, this is a celebration of the creation of the State of Israel by Israeli Jews, which of course is called independence, war of independence. For the Palestinians, on the right side, the word is Nakba in Arabic, which means disaster. And that's how everybody remembers 1948 as the disaster, the great disaster. And still to this day, people remember, right? If you go to some Palestinian in a refugee camp in Lebanon, in their home they will have a key, and you ask them about the key, and they say this is the key to the old house, and they'll name the village. Now I suspect they probably found the key somewhere around the streets of Beirut. And they claim it's the house there, because we make up memories of it, but it doesn't really matter. They infuse that key with real memories. The point is it's very much living, even in 2017. You think it'd be gone, but it's not. So this is how we saw the creation of the State of Israel, and this is how people in the Middle East see the creation of the State of Israel. Right? Stark difference between the two things. The Cold War didn't help things much at all, because American policy in the world, but certainly American policy in the Middle East, was predicated on this anxiety about communism. I'm sure you remember McCarthyism. I'm sure you remember this idea of the nuclear winter that we're going to have. You remember all these things. You teach them, you know them far better than I do. But in the Middle East, that played out very badly. Because in the 50s and 60s now, and I would argue well into the 70s, the Middle East, from the point of the United States, you can either be with us or against us. There is no in the middle. You have to be either for America or for the Soviet Union. In a Cold War that is so stark, you cannot be in between. The problem is this. In the 50s and 60s is when most countries in the Middle East are gaining their independence finally from the French and the British. It's the final stage in which people are seeking independence. And not, by the way, only in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, as well as parts of Asia, which is the moment in which these peoples who have been controlled by the French and the British, whether it is French Indochina, or whether it is French Algeria, or British Egypt, is finally the moment when they are claiming independence. But the problem is, they did not want to take sides. And the United States felt it's very important for them to take one side or the other, because you could not be in a non-aligned club. Although there was an attempt to create a non-aligned. In the Middle East, that nationalism, that idea that we, by the way, celebrate every 4th of July, that patriots claim independence for themselves, because we celebrate that, right? I mean, we call them patriots. We don't call them terrorists. We don't call them anything else. We just think that they're great. They keep the butt of the British. I think it's more complicated story, because some Americans really didn't want to butt of the British. They like the British. But aside from that, we celebrate it. We think it's a great thing to gain independence. And yet, in the Middle East, we didn't think it was such a great thing. Again, the tension between America as a republic and America as an empire. Because to gain independence is very scary. I'll give you an example that I guarantee you your students will not know, because I don't think many high schools teach about this. It's the one time that really it is true that the CIA carried out a coup in the Middle East. Now, I understand that in the Middle East there are so many conspiracy theories that if somebody catches a cold, they suspect the CIA had their hand in it. It is, I can guarantee you. But in this case, in the 1950s, the United States did intervene and overthrow the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran and put back in place the Shah of Iran. It happened. And there was literally CIA agents carrying briefcases filled with American dollars and handing them out to generals of the Iranian armed forces so they can stage a coup d'etat. I mean, it was messy, everybody knew it, and it was terrible. So, because Mossadegh, he is the Prime Minister he was the Prime Minister of Iran, carried on a very nationalist policy. And his chief sin, if you will, was that he nationalized the oil fields. Back to oil. I always joke with my students that after 1948, if I ask you any question, just say oil. 50% of the time it's going to be true. He nationalized oil, and of course you know what nationalization of oil means. It means that the state that represents the people, supposedly, is laying its hand on it. And the British were not happy, because the British had been making a lot of money off the Iranian oil. They had controlled most of southern Iran. They had their own small government, they had their own military. They really had a state within a state. And so when Mohammad Mossadegh decides that he's going to nationalize oil in the name of the Iranian people, the British flip. And they decide this is unacceptable, and they even had a code name for the operation, and British intelligence and American intelligence and the French begin to collude to overthrow it. And ultimately the British lost the job. Their colonial days were long past them, so the Americans have to step in and they overthrow them. I guarantee you every Iranian student learns this. Every Iranian student learned this. This is not something they don't learn. And not only every Iranian student, I learned it in high school, right? This was evidence in which the United States is a hypocritical power. On one hand, it says it wants to be a beacon of democracy. On the other hand, it's overthrowing democratically elected regimes. Because it simply feels threatened because Iran is far too close to the Soviet Union, and because Mohammad Mossadegh was not harsh enough with the Communist Party of Iran. By the way, I mean, the Communist parties in the Middle East were growing and they were very powerful. There's no doubt about that. They actually were some of the best organized political parties, and quite honestly, they were the only parties that had any platform. They actually were modern political parties. They wanted like 40-hour work days. They wanted maternity leave for women. I mean, they were quite progressive in many ways, whatever you think of communism. But nonetheless, we thought communism was the worst thing in the whole wide world. We thought communism is so bad, actually, that the CIA in 1968 handed Saddam Hussein, the guy who ultimately we overthrew, handed him a list of all the communists in Iraq so he can execute them. This is the Saddam Hussein. We gave him the list twice. First time he came in power in 1962, and then the second time when he comes in power, stays in power in 1968. Why? Because we thought communism was far worse than what he is. In other words, the United States was willing to deal with medieval regimes like the Saudis, with authoritarian regimes like Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath, as long as it fit our interests. Now, we are all adults. We understand strategic interests. I have no illusions that every government in the world and every group of people in the world will place their strategic interests at one point or another over their ideals. Right? We do that in our families. We do that in our daily life. I'm not saying this is like the great sin of the world. But what I'm saying is the gap between what the United States does and what the United States says was growing bigger and bigger and bigger. Right? That is what's happening. There was nothing counteracting. There was more and more we are seeing less of American ideals, and more we're seeing more of American power and more of American, well, what people in the Middle East call democracy. So as we lecture about democracy in the world, we are undermining democracy. And by the way, of course, in Latin America we're doing the same thing, and people in the Middle East read about this. They're not just talking about the Middle East, they read about what's happening in Sub-Saharan Africa, about Latin America, with Pinochet, of course. And so this is a global pattern, and Vietnam plays very large in the Middle Eastern media. Again, for propaganda reasons, of course. But the reality is, it's not just propaganda, it's the truth. Let me go fast beyond this. And I want to get to my favorite guy. Nasser. Sure most of you have heard of this man. And he ultimately comes to be the Arab superhero. Right? I mean, he's the guy who was considered to be the savior of the Arab world. The man who is going to somehow completely transform the Arab world into this superpower again. Right? And his moment of glory came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis, when he also nationalized the Suez Canal, because he considered it to be a strategic interest. Now the story here begs a little bit of detail, and I realize we're running out of time, but I just want to sort of focus a little bit on the story, because it helps us understand some of the intricacies of this story. He wanted to build a dam, the Aswan High Dam, to dam up the Nile, so he can generate electricity, so he can modernize his economy. That was what Nasser wanted to do. Nasser was neither pro-Soviet nor pro-American. All he wanted to do was make Egypt a modern nation that is independent, that is proud. He was one of those people, he was a military man, he was very proud, so on and so forth. And he was going to get a loan out of the IMF and the World Bank. And And the only way you get launched like that is that the United States guarantees it. You know the story there. Unfortunately, the United States discovers that he was getting weapons from the Soviet Union because the United States was not selling him weapons, so he was getting weapons. And we sent John Foster Dulles, probably the worst Secretary of State we ever had. Not because he's bad in terms of policy, but the guy had no diplomacy in him. He thought he was in Texas all the time. And he goes and he wags his finger at Nasser. Now, I know this sounds rather silly in the global history, but imagine for a moment Nasser, again, and take this as a metaphor. Nasser is this proud Egyptian who has just successfully kicked the British out in 1954. And here's another white man coming to him and wagging, literally wagging his finger, and telling him, if you do not reject these weapons, we will withdraw the loan. Right? Now that's a moment that captures colonialism and imperialism, because it is this idea of power. And Nasser, out of stupidity, out of arrogance, out of pride, out of justified anger, whatever you read it, again, it's irrelevant, decides, well, screw you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to nationalize Suez Canal. And that's going to give me enough money to build my house on there, which will generate electricity, and I can build my steel and cement factories and become a wonderful power. Right? That's what he thought. Well, the British and the French and the Israelis had a different story, and they invaded and they took over the canal for a bit. But ultimately, the Soviets at that point threatened that if you don't leave, we're going to launch some nuclear weapons at Paris and London. And of course, the United States was freaking out because if they lob those nuclear weapons, we have to lob nuclear weapons. And so actually, that was a pretty bad period, even worse than the Cuban Missile Crisis in some ways. And ultimately, they backed out. And Nasser becomes a hero. Through no fault of his own. Honestly, his army was defeated very quickly, but he stood his ground. And again, look how pathetic it is. This is how pathetic it is. That your army is defeated, the French and the British take over the canal, and still you claim that you won. And you claim you won because you stood your ground. And again, this is important because it's an issue of pride. It's like, I did not blink, and you blinked. Right? This is the moment in which it seemed to be tilting in one direction. And obviously, the conclusion we draw from all of that is Nasser is too dangerous, we have to get rid of him. And so, we have the 1967 war, which ultimately crushes Nasser, and he dies a couple of years after. But I want you to look at this comic. This is a comic that was very popular in Egypt. All right, just read it for a second. Right? Again, the conspiracy theories. Now, quite honestly, given what we hear in the election cycle over and over again, I'm beginning to believe every conspiracy theory I ever hear these days. It's frightening what people do behind closed doors, but again, whether it's true or not is how people came to read this. The destruction of Nasser was read like the destruction of Mossadegh. American hubris, controlling a population. Now, given limited time, I actually want to... So America becomes an enemy, and the side effect is that the idea of Arab nationalism dies when Nasser dies. It seems as a failure. 67 was a devastating war. Israel wins a massive victory, adds some, 30% more territory, completely demolishes the Egyptian troops and the Syrian troops and the Jordanian troops, and they lose fewer soldiers than they ever lost. So it appears that they were the superheroes. And if you look at American newspapers at the time, the Israeli soldiers come out looking like literally Superman. As we are losing in Vietnam, Israel proves itself to be superpower in the Middle East. But that means secular nationalism takes a severe blow, and instead of it, we begin to see the rise of Islamism. This idea of Islam as a political ideology. Because what people begin to see is that we tried capitalism in the 20s, 30s, and 40s and it failed. We tried socialism in the 50s, 60s, and it failed. Let's try Islam. And so that becomes an appealing rallying cry in that regard. And we can talk about this in greater detail later. But this trend away from secular nationalism towards Islam as a political ideology comes to its full bloom, if you will, and at the only time, with the Iranian Islamic Revolution. That takes Iran, which was a chief ally of the United States, gets rid of the Shah, who was put in place, remember, by the United States in the 1950s, mid-1956, and it's replaced by the Islamic Republic. This is the only time we actually have a successful Islamic political movement, and ultimately, that narrative of America as an enemy becomes America as a great state. So we go from Dodge Hall to the great state. Not a really good trajectory. At the same time this is happening, I want to swing us back to the United States for a reason, because I want us to get us to 9/11 and then the invasion of Iraq, and what your students are probably most familiar with. But all of this is happening not in a vacuum. America's policies in the Middle East aren't happening just because of interest. I would argue, I would submit to you, that there's something else at work here, which within Middle Eastern studies we tend to call Orientalism. It's the idea of imagining the Middle East in a certain way. And I don't think you would be surprised by some of these images that I'm going to present here, because actually they're prevalent in American public discourse today about the region and about the people who inhabit the region. And what I would like to argue is that much of our policies weren't only shaped by strategic interests, but they were actually shaped by the images we have of the region and the people that inhabit the region. And that there's a direct link between how we imagine people and what we do to people. So, the United States had thought about the Middle East, had written about the Middle East for a very long time, beginning in the 1700s, in fact. And the idea of the Pirates of North Africa. Right? So, I'm just going to flash some of these images quickly. And you will see that, and this is from the 1950s, again, this image is of the Middle East. And this is from Hollywood. And by the way, if you're interested in seeing sort of a collage of how Hollywood represents the region and its people, go on to YouTube and type in Planet of the Arabs, which of course is a play on Planet of the Apes. And what you'll see is from Valentino and silent era film, all to today, the images are pretty much uniform. They are usually the same thing. There's a guy with something over his head, because otherwise how the hell would you know that he's Arab? Right? I mean, I never grew up with anything on my head, by the way. And what's really remarkable is, it's actually quite powerful. When you hear them, especially until recently, until the 21st century, when you hear people speaking, they sound like dogs. So, Hollywood takes this language, Arabic, a language of over 1,500 years of religion, civilization, philosophy, culture, science, mundane, sublime, and turns it into barking. By the way, these are watched in the Middle East. I'll give you an example. You all remember, I mean, you may have read about it, or you personally may remember, there was a plane, Trans World Airlines, TWA, a plane that was hijacked and landed in Beirut Airport. And at that point, I think, unfortunately, tragically, 2 people were killed, but ultimately there was negotiations and the plane was allowed to leave. Well, in the rendition of Hollywood, it became Delta Force, with that wonderful actor who was full of nuance, Chuck Norris. Right? And this film was made by 2 Israeli cousins who made a series of B films about the Middle East. I watched it in Beirut. I was coming back for vacation and my friends insisted we must go see this fantastic film. So here we are, sitting in a theater in Beirut, the place where the plane landed, where all this took place, and reluctantly I agreed because I hate Chuck Norris, but whatever, we'll go see it and then we'll have a nice meal afterwards. That's always a good thing in Beirut. And we're sitting there, we being represented on the screen. This is how bizarre this becomes. And there's one scene that I'll never forget. The plane lands, and the window, for some bizarre reason, at least probably for cinematic reasons, was open. I've never seen a plane land with the window open, but it was. Right? Because the camera has to have a clear shot. You can't shoot whatever. And there were 3 people in the cockpit. There was a pilot, co-pilot, and there was a civilian. Again, a novelty, even then, I would say. Today, of course, it would be impossible. And, the chummy civilian was sitting there being very helpful. He's like the walking Google of the time. And the co-pilot, first of all, the scene goes to these guys, these, like that. And they're carrying World War II-ish weapons. This is supposed to happen in the 1970s. And they're literally going like this. Literally. There's no airing there. It's literally barking. And then the camera pans back and the co-pilot says, who are they? And then it goes back to the, a little bit more yelping. Then it goes back to the civilian, again, the walking Google, says, they're Arabs. And the pilot says, how do you know? Then of course, to help us really understand, you turn back, and they're barking again with branching weapons, and then it turns back to the civilian and says, I know. That's it. I know. Because it's the image. Now, those images are so powerful because they are constantly repeated. I will challenge you to find more than 1 or 2 out of literally thousands of hours of popular media, possibly even tens of thousands, would have anything positive to say about people in the region. They are irrational, they are violent, they are not to be trusted, they are fanatics, they do not think rationally, they oppress women, and on and on and on. Now, it's not to say there aren't people like that, but quite frankly, there are some, election rallies that I watch that look very much like that. There are Americans who behave that way. There are English people that behave that way. There's every part of the world that behaves that way. But they represent an element and the rest you don't see. So my point is this: when you have these images, even policymakers are taking them in, and as such, they act upon it. You cannot rationalize with the people in the region. How can you rationalize somebody barking like a dog? How can you talk sense? How can you have negotiations? How can you have diplomatic relations with somebody who's a fanatical who just wants to kill you? There's no way. Because the conclusion is the only solution is you kill him. Now, I'm being overly dramatic, I recognize that, but not terribly much, by the way. Because in some ways, if you look at the invasion of Iraq, the language was used there as well. There's a moment in which, as we're beginning to ramp up to the war, Rumsfeld and Richard Pearl and the various other people involved, what we ultimately come to know as the neoconservatives, or the hawks of the the younger Bush administration, make that statement is that the only way these people will understand, the only thing these people understand is power. Because it's true. I mean, if somebody's coming at me like that, I'm not going to say, hey, would you like a cup of tea and perhaps you can talk? I'm going to shoot first and ask questions second. And if your notion of the region is that it's filled with a bunch of people like that who hate America, and of course, for most of the American general public, it's like that question after 9/11, why do they hate us? Do you remember that Time magazine? I mean, think about that. Why do they hate us? So there's they, there's us, and hate. That's the relationship. Gone are the missionaries, gone are all the relations that we've had, the students who come here, the economic relations we've had, the good hummus we've been eating, that's gone. Right? It's simply they and us and hate. That becomes the foundation. And of course, with that historical understanding that we have just gone through very quickly, the only explanation could be that it's something in their culture. And so is it surprising then that this narrative of radical Muslims and radical Islam becomes a prevalent narrative? That's how we understand 9/11 and everything before and everything after, is that these people are just like that. There's something in the Quran that makes them like that. Which of course is nonsense. I mean, have you read the Old Testament? I mean, there's genocide, there is slavery, there is rape, and I'm speaking as a Christian, a very profound Christian. I'm not a Muslim, so I'm not defending my faith or the religion of my parents. If anything, my father didn't like Islam very much at all. I'm going to have arguments about that. But the point of the matter is, it's not Islam. Islam doesn't explain anything. When you have 1.4 billion Muslims in the world, stretching from Indonesia all the way to Alaska, if it really is just religion, then we should have 1.4 billion terrorists. That would be a sight to see. And it's easy to kill people, by the way, unfortunately, in life. We've seen it done with a truck in Paris, and in France, southern France. There could be a lot more of these incidents, and yet there aren't. So Islam is not the answer, but in the minds of people, both general public, including your students, by the way, as well as policymakers, and that's even more dangerous. That's it. This popular culture is not insignificant. It's not immaterial. It's not just entertainment. It is how people understand their world. And by the way, in the years I've been teaching Middle Eastern history, I finally understood that I can stand there and speak for 15 weeks, and Hollywood will tell it more. It is sad, but it's true. Their games, have you watched the video games they play? I have started playing games. Not really, I've always loved playing games. But I play video games, and then I realized those are stories being told. And then every time you shoot, the bad guys will play these guys. Unless you're doing the Halo, that's kind of freaky looking things. But the point is, these are not just stories. These are how people form their world vision. And it's very powerful. It's very powerful. Look at the show Madam Secretary, right? which celebrates. I mean, the narrative there is very powerful. It's celebrating the rise of a woman to the position of Secretary of State of the United States. What an amazing thing! But if you look at all the bad guys, generally speaking, 90% of the time they come from the Middle East. So it's a region that is filled with people like that, and therefore we must intervene. And we have intervened repeatedly. I'll get to 9/11 and the last invasion, but just brief. So Lebanon, we landed troops in 1958 and 1982. In 1967, as you saw from the previous thing, we supposedly were involved. I don't know that we were in that, but certainly in 1973 we were involved in the Arab-Israeli war. The Iran-Iraq war, we were very heavily involved. Heavily involved. This is a time when the United States and its allies really provide, as Saddam Hussein, with dual-purpose equipment. Helicopters for spraying agriculture, but also for spraying Kurds and killing them. Right? This whole premise of chemical and biological warfare was started in 1980 using German and French products that the United States approved. Because at that time, he was fighting our biggest enemy, which is Iran. We were providing him with satellite imagery. Every Thursday, a car would leave from Amman, Jordan, CIA, arrives in Baghdad, and deliver us to the headquarters of the armed forces there, detailed maps of where the Iranian troop movements are so that they can concentrate the Iraqis can concentrate their troops to face it. There was one major battle in the Khater region in southern Iraq that the Iranians would have completely overrun the Iraqi defenses and have gone all the way to Baghdad had the United States not intervened directly. In other words, we were very heavily involved. And of course, as you remember, our Navy was heavily involved. And of course, the first Gulf War, well, Saddam Hussein brilliantly decided that he's going to take over Kuwait. We can talk about the reasons later. We go in under the first Bush administration and we kick them out and then we retreat. So there's that involvement. Now that war didn't destroy Iraq. But that war began to put an end. That in some ways is the beginning of the end of the current regime in the Middle East. The one that was built by the French and the British on these nation states begins to crumble here. This is where you begin to see falter. Because the United States lands 500,000 troops in what's considered to be the holiest land for its Muslims, in Saudi Arabia. And they would attack. So Saudi Arabia, that is supposed to be upholding Islam and Islamic ideals, is now host to an imperial power that is attacking another Muslim nation. When Egyptian troops, who by the way were sent in alliance with the United States in the First Gulf War, came back to Cairo, people lined the roads and spit on them. That's how they thought of them. They spit on them. Because they saw them as traitors. Again, we can disagree with this. I'm not saying they were right to spit on them, that this was a wrong war. Please don't misunderstand that. What I'm saying is, think about the amount of anger that generates within the population. Because they didn't read it as a moment. We read it, so Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, we must get him out. They didn't read it as that. They read it through the lens of history. They read it, the British are back. Right? Once again, we will be subjugated to another imperial force. And we saw the images that we saw, and this is really quite dramatic in the differences. The images we saw from the First Gulf War were highly sanitized. And this is when the United States Armed Forces did a brilliant job controlling the media, because they learned from the Vietnam case. You don't let reporters run amok, because you're going to show everything. So all we saw are these incredibly sanitary images, right? The plane drops a bomb, it has a camera, you see the crosshairs, and a plume comes up. Which is brilliant, like you're playing a video game, but you don't see the body parts. That is where Al Jazeera comes in. Because Al Jazeera showed the body parts. And the craters, and the destroyed homes, and people wailing, and it showed it again, and again, and again. Just like we, after 9/11, we replayed that horrific scene of the planes flying into the World Trade Center. Those images were played again, 24-hour cycle. And that's where Al Jazeera becomes a household name in the Middle East. Because they do what no other outlet does. All the government-controlled outlets, silent. Because why would Egyptian television show what America and its allies, including the Egyptian regime, are doing to fellow Arabs? They wouldn't. But Al Jazeera showed it. and showed it in all its brutality. I mean, really brutal aspect. And in some ways, one can critique it as pornography of sort, but on the other hand, it's actually a very honest representation of what war does to people. It literally tears them from limb to limb. And it's horrifying. And you cannot but question the morality of that move when you see that. You cannot talk at the level of high strategic notions. You know, this and that. When you see the human damage. And that's what people saw. That's what people experienced on the ground. And that, whatever shred of legitimacy, whatever shred of decency was left in regimes that are authoritarian, that are oppressive of their people, and many of them are only there because they're allies of one superpower or the next, but in 1991, it's generally speaking the United States because the Soviet Union is gone. Whatever shred of legitimacy they had, it was gone. None of them had legitimacy anymore. And the system had no legitimacy. The system of nation states that was created in World War I completely lost its legitimacy. And that's when you begin to see the descent into the hell that is happening today in the Middle East. It didn't happen just yesterday or in 2010. It began in 1991. Because the populations of the region no longer had any faith in their own governing bodies. They saw them as nothing more than oppressive brutes who are only there because the United States keeps them there. So, then you have the rise of non-state actors. In Lebanon, it's Hezbollah, but Al-Qaeda is another one, and of course ISIS is the most horrific of the bunch. They rise in this vacuum of legitimacy. They rise in this bankruptcy of visions. Remember Nasser, the hero of the Arab world, who everybody thought was going to save it? When he died, that dream died with him. And people in the Middle East have been left with nothing. Right? Their moonshot was gone. And in essence, what you see with the non-state actors is they fill that gap. Yes, some of them carry out violent attacks, especially Daesh or ISIS. They're horrifying. They're a complete abomination of humanity. But at the same time, they are filling a political and a visionary vacuum that was created by both local authoritarian regimes and unrelenting violence that was brought on by war after war in the Middle East. This leads us to 9/11. 9/11 doesn't happen in a vacuum. And please, again, do not misunderstand me. I'm not excusing the act. It's a horrifying act. It's a disgusting act. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It's not because a bunch of Muslims just got angry. There's a whole history that's feeding into this. Right? It's just, this is what's so frustrating about this whole matter. So, these non-state actors then, yeah, from outside they appear to us as nothing more than, a bunch of, butchers. And they are some of them, not Hezbollah so much. Hezbollah actually is a fairly valid organization, more or less. But ISIS, of course, is horrifying. But at the same time, you have to see from within, in which people are so desperate for somebody to give them a hope, a vision, and some sort of legitimacy. So we get to Iraq. By this time, the United States has zero capital with the population of the Middle East. Ironically, 9/11, of course, brings up a wave of sympathy. I mean, when 9/11 happens, it was announced at a soccer stadium in Iran, in Tehran, the capital, and people stood there for a moment of silence. Unbidden, nobody told them to do it, but all of a sudden everybody just stood in silence because they were horrified by 9/11. I mean, again, there was a sense of sympathy, at least for that brief moment, to what the United States went through. And even in the Middle East, you can see people being horrified by this act. They saw it as completely illegitimate and horrifying. But what people don't get is how do you go from that to invading a country like Iraq? Right? And that's why the sympathy evaporates within about 5 minutes. Because how do you go from a group that is a non-state actor, Al-Qaeda, that in many ways is a byproduct of American interventions in Afghanistan, that turned that country in the 1980s in the Cold War confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States in Afghanistan, that turned it into a lawless, decentralized, chaotic place that allows the rise of organizations like the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. How do you go from that to invading the country? Under absolutely ridiculous pretext. And perhaps the most laughable of the pretexts, forget the weapons of mass destruction. We all know that's a farce. And I'm sure Colin Powell regrets ever going to the United Nations with those flimsy PowerPoints of his. That probably is the lowest point in a very noble and good man's career. Forget oil, although there was a meeting on September 12th with Dick Cheney sharing with all his oil buddies who basically decided that this is a good idea to do. Forget all of that. The notion that we can actually say we're invading Iraq because we want to bring democracy was laughable. I mean, that was absolutely laughable to people in the region. Again, we may disagree with that. We may think we are very sincere. I don't think we were. But let's say we were. For the people of the region, they read it through the history of the 20th century. Are you kidding me? Do you remember Mossadegh? Do you remember Nasser? Do you remember Lebanon? Do you remember 1991? What democracy are you guys talking about? Yeah. Which is, of course, we didn't help things matter with the Bulgaria prison. So ultimately, for people of the region, whether they are being wrong or right, they saw this invasion of Iraq as nothing more than America trying to impose its imperial will. We saw this image in which we pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein as this moment in which, this noble moment in which we finally rid the Iraqis of a dictator. Very much a dictator, by the way, that was a dictator in 1968 and 1980 and so on and so forth, when we actually, but he was our dictator. And again, I'm saying this not facetiously, I'm saying this as somebody in the region would say it, because they remember that. We may not remember it, your students will not remember it, but they remember it. And if they forget it, their parents will remind them. Because again, history is ever present. Because the problem is, for people who are occupied, they can't help it. History becomes part of their DNA. The occupier usually wants to ignore history because it doesn't look pretty. But the occupier does not have that luxury because the history of the violence and the history of everything visited upon them becomes part of who they are. And so we can, talk to people and they say, why are you so keep going back? In some ways they can't help it. Because in fact, every time, it's not that they want to always think historically. Many of these people, and I know from my nephews down to people I don't know, have the same hopes and aspirations as your students. They want to get a job, they want to get a boyfriend or girlfriend, they want to go out and party. They don't have a great time, by the way, if they ever go. My nephews took me and it was exhausting. And they want to go to movies, they want to go do consumer therapy, buying things when they're really sad, which I love to partake of here. They're normal and banal and exciting in every other, like any other human being. But there's one element that sits on them like a cloud, which is that history. They cannot escape it. Every time they try to escape it, every time they try to rebuild, a bomb lands. And I have to tell you, growing up in a civil war, bombs do a lot of damage. And I'm not talking about a hole in my bedroom, or my mother getting shrapnels on her side, and seeing her bleed. I'm talking about the repercussions down the line. You don't forget those things. It makes you constantly think and rethink what you're going to do. Because why would you rebuild if you think bombs are going to come again? It saps the one essence of humanity, hope. It takes it away. It crushes it. What actually surprises me about the Middle East is how the younger generation still maintains hope. I find that to be flabbergasting. I was in Beirut in May, and I went to Jordan, and I went to Egypt. And I found with the younger generation, they're experimenting with new music, new art, new theater, new filmmaking, with new ideas, new businesses. It's remarkable, actually. In the midst of chaos, that they're doing this. And I would look at them, and I asked one of them, I said, I don't get this. Where are you getting all this energy from? And he said, in some ways, it's the only thing I have left. Because that's the only way I can claim to be a human being. I have to live. There's always a sense of desperation in that act. So, we see liberation, people of the region see it as the British. The British invaded Iraq in 1920 to occupy it and make it into Iraq. And they installed a new king that they brought from Saudi Arabia. And they put it there, Hashemite king. We invaded, and we put a new group of people in charge. Mostly people who haven't been in Iraq for 30 years, foreigners in essence. So, for people living in Iraq, they read it in that sense. So in some ways, one begins to ask the question if this is the end of the American century. And it's a very sad question. Because I actually, it sounds corny, but I love this country. I really do. It's a very corny thing to say, and I'm not trying to manipulate your emotion. I'm just speaking very honestly. I actually love this place. With all its warts and foibles and imperial hubris and ridiculous racism. Because I experienced it, and as I'm sure many of you have experienced it. And misogyny, which we have seen on display recently. But I love this place. Because there's one element about it in which there's still an ideal about it. I mean, I'm sorry, there is an ideal. When Mr. Obama was elected president, I thought that was my moonshot. And I'm not black. But it's like amazing. It's a story. It's like, what a story. And Mrs. Obama, when she gave that speech, it's like, what a story. This is the story of this country, how brilliant it is. And I love it because of its ideas, and I love it because it's educated. Does anybody know what a cruise missile is going for these days? How much does it cost to buy a cruise missile? I should say that as an error, being recorded. That's not a very good thing. I'm just kidding. It's not for me. Let's say $10 million, $3 million. Do you know how much it costs to educate somebody? I mean, I look at you and I think you are in the most noble profession in the world. Because you guys, people like you, educated me. This is amazing. This is a gift we give. Because the American higher education system is to this day the best higher education system in the world. Which is why people desperately want to get into American universities, including Wake Tech. Because they know this. So this is what's maddening. We have this amazing stuff that goes on. And then we give people this. So, well, actually, just this. I mean, it's almost like we are our own worst enemies. It's just, in some ways, crazy. And it would be sad to be the end of the American century because I think the United States has so much to offer this world. Like every other country. I don't think America is exceptional, by the way. I think it is an amazing country, but Sweden is a pretty nice place too. And Scotland's lovely. You should go on vacation. It's a good place. Except for the hags. But the point is, regardless of whether exceptional or not, that's a ridiculous notion. We're not, we have problems like everybody else. But it would be sad if we actually completely withdraw the positive things about it. But the reality is, it seems to be that we are at loss. The Middle East is falling apart. The story I just told in very sort of brief outlines is the story of the death of this, the creation of the early part of the 20th century and its death in the early part of the 21st century. This 100-year period. It's collapsing. The whole nation states are falling apart. Authoritarian regimes are completely defunct, delegitimized, but the Arab Spring, which was a brief moment of hope in which the people might take over, seems to be gone. And replaced by the bombardment of Aleppo as we see unfolding every day, the horror. So on one hand, and we look unable to do anything. The Russians are being muscular again, whatever the hell that means, which basically translates into this as far as I can tell. But the reality is, we just seem to not sure where we're going to go from here. Because the way we dealt with the Middle East is gone. We have in essence lost any sense of control over the region because we have forgotten how we dealt with the Middle East when we first built Burj Hall. And the way we have dealt with the Middle East since 1948 is no longer tenable. It's not acceptable. It's expensive to say the least. We lost 4,411 soldiers. And in your classroom sit many others who are still dealing with the aftershock of that. And 500,000 Iraqis were killed. Some people estimate as high as 1 million. Right? It's not tenable. And it cost us $1 trillion and an economic recession in 2008, part of it anyway. So that's not possible. So we don't really know. That's why we're paralyzed. People criticize Mr. Obama for not doing more, but the question is, do what? There's a sense in which nobody quite knows what to do now. It is just, all we seem to be knowing is to just bomb more. I mean, the Russians seem to be really happy to do it again and again. Right? And so, but I think the bigger problem, and this is a really dangerous problem, is the weight of American culture. I grew up in American culture, good and bad. I remember saving to buy my first pair of jeans. They were Lee's. I thought it was so cool. I listened to American music. I went to American in films, I watched American TV. I actually grew up on Leave It to Beaver, Wally Wally and GB. I saw Andy Griffith even. I didn't know Andy Griffith was here, but there you go. Right? I watched Star Trek. I used to love Star Trek. Still do. But it wasn't that part of American culture. This is American culture that's incredibly hopeful and future forward. I mean, I remember watching Armstrong land on the moon. And I remember the sense of awe that we all shared in, right? So there's a sense of element to it. But today we have lost that. American culture now is losing. It's not that there aren't American films or American TV shows or American music. Believe me, they still exist. And American food chains, too many of them. They exist. But I'm talking about the profound aspect of American culture that's being lost. The intellectual, liberal arts education, idealistic, utopian vision of humanity. That's what American culture I'm talking about. The consumer crap is still there, right? McDonald's is everywhere. So is, Kentucky Fried Chicken. I don't know why the heck people like Kentucky Fried Chicken. I mean, chicken shawarma is so much better. But anyway, there you go. But the aspect about America, what it really stands for, there's a sense of diminution in the country that I sense. Partly it's because we've become a multipolar world. That's normal. But partly it's because we have lost so much in this country. We have, it's not just a human toll and financial toll. We have actually probably cost ourselves our biggest impulse in the region, which is our ideals and our claim to a high moral ground. We have lost that. And in that sense, that could be the biggest loss we have suffered in the Middle East. Thank you so much.